This is Sam Long.
I'm John Nugent.
And I am Ron Peters.
Welcome to the After Class Podcast.
Because the best conversations happen
After class.
Thanks for joining us. Another episode of the After Class Podcast. We're glad to have you along. This episode is going to be released while Ron is in Hawaii.
Oh, yeah, baby.
And John and I will be digging out of snow that's headed our way. So, hope you enjoy it.
Happy to do it, man. Somebody's got to do it. Leading a group of students over there for a short-term mission trip. And every time you tell people, like, yeah, we're taking students on a short-term mission trip, they're like, where are you going? Well, we're going to Hawaii. You always get the same response. It's like, oh, roughing it in Hawaii. Oh, that sounds so bad. Because they think you're going to a resort. You're going to spend every day on the beach. You're going to play volleyball and do all that kind of stuff. And trying to explain to them that there will be a little bit of free time. And yes, we'll do a few fun Hawaii things. But we're mostly going to be doing things like working with churches and working with the youth and working on a taro farm and helping out, different people. It's like, it's a beautiful state, but we're going to be working. We're not going to be playing volleyball and swimming in the ocean the whole time. So
You don't have to defend yourself to us.
not to you guys,
To listeners.
but to the listeners. When Sam says Ron's taking a group to Hawaii, there are people like
With such disdain.
yeah,
It's
it's such a rough job, horrible thing.
well, my son will be with you, so make sure you work him plenty hard.
Even if you were, 50% recreation, you're still going there as a mentor and a guide for students and helping them in some of them their first cross-cultural experience, even though it's not a transnational. I mean, it's a different world.
It is, and they speak English and they use American money. But once you start doing that, though, once you're working like on a taro farm, it's like, oh, this is not how I think of Hawaii. Like you're working, you're like up to your knees in cold water and pulling the taro out, and you're learning about what it means to live there and try to support your family. And it's just not the same that people recognize. So it is very much a cross-cultural experience.
I always wondered where tarot cards came from, but apparently the water. I did not realize you just pull them right out. That's impressive.
Impressive. I know,
Okay.
right? That's why they're so waterproof.
Magic soil.
Yeah. Are you guys going to be doing anything for Week of Outreach?
Working. John?
That's about it.
Yep.
That's about it. Staying local.
I got some minor things, but they got to take care of a few things and just hanging out. Yep.
Yeah. Well, today we're supposed to get snow, though. I mean, the day we're recording, right now it's clear outside. By this time tomorrow, we're going to have probably 6 inches of snow on the ground. So
It looks like the flurries have begun.
I'm seeing a little bit of snow coming out outside
It's
the
kind of
window.
light.
And it's like the cottonwood in the air. Just kind of.
Yeah, right.
That's why I'm sneezing today.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, okay, I got it.
So that's about it, right?
Yeah, that's it.
That's all the news.
We don't have a lot of news except Ron. Looking forward to hearing how it goes.
I'm looking forward to telling you when we get back.
Well, in the meantime, we are plodding our way through another couple of chapters today. One to be released when you guys are hearing it, and the other chapter to be released the week after, because Ron's going to be gone during our
Get a couple
normal
recordings in today.
recording. But today we're talking about Chapter 5 of Priestly Presence, A Church for the World's Sake. And we are diving into another dimension of Levitical existence. And we've been unpacking the function of Israelite priests. And last week we focused on their nature as exiles. We gave a little backstory to the historical Levi and what led them to an exilic status. And this time we're talking about the priestly legacy associated with the Israelite function the priestly function of hosting these cities of refuge.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And the title is chapter Risky Hospitality. And so we're going to begin like last week with, what happened in the life of the early Levitical priests that kind of paved the way for this function as kind of those who offer risky hospitality. Sam, you want to kick us off?
How?
You're an Old Testament expert.
Tell us about these. Well, just to jump back, I think the cities of refuge are a fascinating topic because I think people, they hear about it, they kind of know they exist, but what were these cities of refuge?
Right.
They just have a name, but they don't really have a detailed description. And so I think that the better we can help people understand the cities of refuge, it will explain things even in the modern age, when a church all of a sudden becomes a refuge place. It's that's not something that just came out of nowhere. There's actually a biblical precedent for that. And whether you agree or disagree with it, you can at least recognize, oh yeah, okay, now I know how that works. So like explaining the cities of refuge, I think is going to really help people understand what it means to be a Levite. I guess I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, I'd say the biggest thing we need to first get our minds around is the difference in cultures, which is always when it comes to the Bible, what we should start with.
Right, yeah.
Because we live in a world where, we have jurisprudence. We have, like, when something happens, there are steps to be taken, right?
Oh, yeah.
And in the ancient world, it was the Wild Wild West was probably the closest, like, to it, where if someone were to kill someone else, a lot of times there was no law enforcement. Your family took care of it, right? And so, like, you've heard of blood feuds, like the Hatfields, McCoys, and like that's the closest in time to us. But way back then, I mean, tribes would go to war because someone killed someone from your tribe, right? And a lot of different shows are kind of built on that, where there's this allegiance to your people, and if someone does something against your people, now we're going to retaliate. And so the ancient world was kind of crazy, and so there are a lot of killing, a lot of things happening. And we see it all the way at the beginning of the Bible, right? Where we have Cain kills Abel. He's worried for his own life. Lamech's like, no one will touch me. Like, because there's this expectation that there is retribution, right? And so the cities of refuge come along and say, we're not going to be like that, right? We're going to create a system in which people are protected until it's clear that that person should suffer the consequence. So it's a major thing that they're trying to do is avoid, like, all-out warring and fighting and feuding and bloodshed, and say, no, yes, the person is responsible for his or her actions, but we're not going to escalate it into this insane, like, warring, right?
Yeah. The cities of refuge are grounded in kind of an Israelite, and I think like a God's eye perspective on the sacredness of life and blood. Before the flood, right, where God kind of purges the earth of violence, and he says, from now on it will be life for life.
Life for life,
right? And because you just can't go around being violent the way they were before the flood. Like, life, blood is sacred. And like you brought up with Cain, like, this world got plunged into sin and violence through the act of bloodshed, right? And after God kind of floods the earth because things got so out of control, he institutes this life for life to kind of keep the sacredness of life kind of in front of his people, right? And so if an animal kills a person, that animal actually gets killed, right? And if a person kills a person, that person gets killed. And it's God's way of, like you were describing, keeping by God giving a regulation on this is what must be done when life is taken. He's taking it out of our hands to say, what do we think should be done? Right. And that's where you have, like, you hurt me so bad, I'm going to hurt you double.
Right.
Yeah.
And then it just kind of, well, then I'm going to hurt you triple, and I'm going to hurt you, 70 times 7. We're going to escalate it and just make things worse. God is in Torah kind of devising a system to keep blood sacred, right? And so he has kind of a few principles in mind that kind of safeguard lifeblood in a context where someone has been killed. Were you going to say something, Ron?
Well, just to back up just a little bit before we move on ahead, I think what makes it hard for people to understand in at least sort of 21st century America is that we have all these layers of protection around us. We have a police force, and we have a legal system, and we have courts, and all of these things are the mechanisms that we have to go through in order to sort of rectify a wrong situation. If I've been wronged, I don't get to go out and just, take vengeance. Okay, the police are there, the courts are there. And so when people take it upon themselves, when they take sort of justice in their own hands, we find that very offensive. It's like, you can't do that. That's wrong. And we learn that at a very early age. And so what our listeners have to do is throw that all out and go back to a time where that's exactly how you did things.
Right.
You didn't have a police force or a court system or anything like that. At best, maybe you could take it to the elders of your village, right there at the gate of the city. But most of the time, whatever happens, you got to deal with it yourself. And that's the norm. Our normal would be weird to them. Their normal is weird to us. And so I want to get people thinking in those terms so they understand the world that we're talking about. Our normal is so far removed from what their normal would be.
Yeah. Good preface. So I have 4 principles lined out that like what God has done to provide for restraint on killing when someone has been killed. And the first restraint he places is that only the slayer may be killed. Like only the person who did the killing can be killed. And again, that holds off the retaliation by escalation, right? That's an easy one. We've kind of said that. And the next one, I think this is where you were getting at, Ron. The blood of the slayer may only be shed by the nearest kin of the deceased. Mm-hmm. Yeah, what's going on with that?
Yeah, that's a fascinating one, just because, again, I think it's trying to limit the extent of the feuding that's going to take place. So ideally, you take the person who's most affected, who's the closest to them, and they're the one who's going to actually enact it. But I think you make the point that the word there is not translated well all the time. That like there's more redemption of the life involved by the taking of the one who did the slaying.
Yeah, some translations refer to the next of kin as the blood avenger.
Yeah, and that has the connotation. Yeah, like it's a superhero. I don't know. That's not what's happening.
Yeah, they hurt you by taking the life of your brother or your sister, and you must avenge.
Right, and that's feudal language, right? That's not what we want. Yeah,
So the word in the Hebrew is right from goel, right?
Yeah.
Goel, which
for
is
redeeming. Yeah, for redeemer. Yeah.
So should we imagine it though as like whenever there's an injustice or something happens, most people see it as like this everything's thrown out of balance, and we need to reestablish like balance. We need to reestablish a kind of equilibrium in our social circle. And so the person who is, whether you call it the blood avenger or whatever, it's like
blood redeemer.
In a way, that the job of that person is to take the imbalanced situation and reestablish a kind of balance. You know, that's the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. It's like because you theoretically knocked out my eye, the only way I can balance the situation out is to have your eye taken out or whatever. Is that a fair way of describing it? Do you think that's sort of getting at the sense of what that person's job becomes? It's like you got to reestablish balance to the situation.
Yeah, I think with a lot of the eye for eye, tooth for tooth, I think that's exactly what's going on. I think something more is going on with death. Like avenger means it's about me, me getting revenge, so that I feel better. Like I vented my wrath, my rage.
My family's at peace now that we've gotten back.
But redeeming kind of points to something higher. Like this life belongs to God. This person was made in his image. It's his holy order that has been violated. He is the giver and taker of life. The life belongs to him. Mm-hmm. So when someone kills someone, it's not just the family's loss who's connected to them. It's God's claim on life that has been violated. And so deaths are talked about in Torah as the land is affected and the death must be atoned for. Right, and the land itself has been defiled, and that has nothing to do with the family. It has to do with this is God's land. It is sacred space set apart to create a holy people who is going to be a blessing to all nations. Right, and it's that promise, that holiness, God's claim on the land, and what happens in the land that has been violated. And so the redemption is, it's God ultimately who has been violated the most. And then the question is, well, who would be the appropriate party to uphold God's claim on this life that has been stolen? And it's interesting that God doesn't choose, appoint a hangman.
Yeah.
Right? Appoint an executioner of some sort, someone who is totally neutral and detached. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, our sheriffs and our executioners, the ones who do this, are not the family members. It's strangers who were not directly affected by the murder.
Yeah.
It's interesting that God didn't go that route. Like he's like, the person who's best able to redeem this life, I want to be someone who was perhaps the most impacted by it. Why do you think that is, Sam?
I think it has to do with because killing is a serious thing. And it's, I think you may use the word detached. It's not a detached thing. Right. There's no such thing as an impartial killing, right? And yeah, we say there is, but in God's view, there's not. And so the closest redeemer, kinsman person is already invested in it. And so on the one hand, it brings closure because it's life for life, but also it keeps someone else from being drawn into it. And going back to like, the more people you add into it, the more that are going to be effective. I don't know how many studies have been done on it, but I can't imagine what it's like for the person who has to do the killing in like prisons of these death row inmates. Like, what does that do to a person?
Yeah,
I don't know. And so it removes that. It's like this person is looking for a vengeance, even though it's not theirs. God says, no, it's mine. But this also brings some closure for you. And so I think it's limiting the number of people who are actually involved with the killing, which God doesn't want any of it. But this has happened, and now this must be atoned for.
I often wonder what would happen if in our modern system of jurisprudence, that if somebody has a death sentence, that the person most directly affected by it would be the one to throw the switch or push the button or whatever, and how that would affect death. It's like, yeah, I'll let somebody else kill him. But if you're going to be the one, and you got to look that person in the eye, and again, you've got anger and you've got hurt. This is the person who killed my loved one or whatever. But you know that you have a legally sanctioned opportunity to take that person's life. How many people would go, I can't do it? You know, it's a little bit off track here, but I think it's significant. Like, it's very easy to say I want him dead and let somebody else do it. When you've got to do it, there's something inside of us that goes, I don't know if I can do that.
Yeah,
it's a big deal.
There's a way in which it acknowledges the sacredness of the life being taken. I really like the way you put it, Sam. I never thought of it this way. Like, already the next of kin is deeply vested, right? And he's already embroiled in bloodshed because it was his next of kin that was killed. Right? He can't undo himself from that connection.
Right.
So by having another person do it, well, now you're bringing a third party involved, and now it went from 2 people who are deeply affected to 3.
Yeah.
Right? It's just kind of expanding. And I imagine in Israelite society, like when the next of kin doesn't do something, then you go to the next of next. Right? It's just, and I imagine there may be some people's like, I'm not doing this. All right. Well, who's next? Who else is already involved in this? Who's in a better position to do this? Right. But I think it does keep the circle from widening out. And I think also you were right in saying, like, what does it do to a person who is the professional killer? Like, it creates in Israel a killing class.
Yeah.
Like a people who have to kind of sear their consciences from the fact that they kill for a living. And, and so God does not want Israel to have a professional killing class. And he also, in Torah, doesn't want them to have a standing army.
Right.
That he will, in an ad hoc way, raise up people to fight a war when it needs to be fought. But he doesn't want Israel to have a professional class of killers. That's what the nations have. That's what, when the sons of God and daughters of men, and you have these Nephilim, these kind of warrior hero class, like it's a set apart killer class to defend the power of the sons of God that are the ones that escalated violence on the earth. And he is raising up a people who will be an alternative to the violent ways of the nations around and the power bearers. And so God, the life is his. It's not anyone else's. And he doesn't want a professional killer class thinking that life belongs to them, that they are the life takers. And so God keeps it personal. And that makes sense because it's already personal for those people.
For sure.
Exactly.
They can't undo their connection to this. They can only execute God's wish that the land and the people be atoned for by setting things right, by taking the life. So that's a second principle. And it's just pregnant, right, with meaning and implications. Another thing is that because someone might falsely accuse someone of taking a life, at least 2 witnesses must confirm a deliberate act of bloodshed. And this is an interesting law because if 2 witnesses are required and only one person saw it, someone who did it is going to get off scot-free.
Correct.
Why would God do that?
Well, I mean, I think the reason God would do that is to avoid, well, I think of like Naboth's vineyard and all the rest, where still people are brought up to lie and say things against someone that aren't true, right? And so I think part of it is just to keep some sort of accountability and make sure that there are not injustices. They will happen anyway, as we see. But so the one who, the offended party doesn't say, "Oh, I saw it for sure." Like well, were you alone? Well, sure, I was alone, but that doesn't matter. I saw it. Well, I'm sorry, you're too invested in this, right?
Yeah.
There's too much going on. We're going to need some outside corroboration. And so it's like an early form of like bringing evidence that's required to, without a reasonable doubt or whatever the standard
Indisputable
is.
visual
Yeah, and so
evidence.
so it's just part of, I think it's part of accountability. It's part of just making sure everything's on the up and up, and it's to avoid, ideally abuses of these principles in order to get back at someone. And so if it's life for life, but if someone did something against me that really ticked me off but was not taking a life, and I'm really mad at them, I could elevate it to life.
Yeah.
By accusing them of this other thing that didn't act, So I think it's keeping everything on the up and up, because God doesn't want escalations.
Yeah. And it's almost like the party is being protected in this is the innocent person who's falsely accused.
Right.
And that life is so sacred to God that innocent people do not get killed needlessly, that he's willing to risk guilty people getting off scot-free.
That's the very point I was thinking of, yeah. Yeah, and I think there are a lot of people who are like, oh my gosh, that's so unjust. Not debating the point that sometimes guilty people get away with it, but I just want to reinforce what you're saying there, John, that God cares about the innocent being protected. And so protecting the innocent, especially still living in a broken world where sin still runs rampant at times, means that protecting the innocent means certain guilty people are going to get away with it. And I hate it. I'm not saying it's okay, but it seems like the kind of price you're willing to pay to protect the lives of those who would be falsely accused and maybe suffer as a direct consequence of that.
Yeah. In God's economy of grace, it's far worse to condemn an innocent person than to let a guilty person go free.
Amen.
And I think we see that.
That's a beautiful way to put it. Like in his economy, like for us, we can't stand the injustice.
Right, yeah.
God can.
Yeah.
Yeah, he can deal with it way better than we can.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. In the next version of this, I'm going to add that line. In God's economy of grace. That's beautiful. So a fourth principle, since people sometimes kill a neighbor purely by accident, that happens, an innocent slayer must be protected by due process or something like that. That's kind of anachronistic language. But so a proper trial must be held. The blood redeemer must be prevented from killing the slayer until the community has confirmed that they are in fact guilty with the help of two witnesses. And so there needed to be a way to protect a potentially innocent slayer while a proper trial is conducted. And this is where, finally, 23 minutes into the episode, the Levites come in. So what role do they play?
So they're kind of like, it reminds me of in John Wick, the Continental, where like that's this safe space that even though there are all these killers, but once you enter into the hotel, like there's no killing, right? And so they're the ones who allow for, okay, until we figure this out, this is the safe space. And so we see another version of that in the Bible, the horn of the altar, where they would run and grab the horn. It's like if you're playing tag, and it's like it's base, right? Like no one can't get me, and that's kind of what that's functioning as. Like, okay, yes, they're under my protection, but also under like we're going to figure this out, right? It's not like I'm gonna hide them here forever. And so I think a lot of people view these sort of refugee cities as like, oh, we'll just hide out here until the authorities get sick of it and go home. Like, no, we're going to figure it out, but to avoid false accusations, to avoid death that doesn't need to happen, like let's take a pause and let the system do its work. And so they are this impartial, like we're not rendering judgment. They're just here under our protection until it's decided what's supposed to happen to them.
Yeah. So some Levites and their whole families, like, they were placed as exiles into the land of the tribe of Gad, Manasseh, Ephraim, and they have their towns. Issachar's really been underrepresented.
I agree. I'm more of a Zebulun man.
But like some of those towns that were given to Levites to live in are these cities of refuge. Like some kids are being raised in a city of refuge.
Yeah.
And what their city is famous for is this is where killers come.
And murderers go hang out there.
A lot of bad guys in town.
Until a trial can be conducted. And so these Levitical families had to have peace with this whole process.
Yeah.
And they had to deal with the fact that their community has to make space for killers, and
or at least accused killers.
some of whom are going to be innocent, right, and some who are going to be guilty. And of course, anyone who's taken refuge there is going to be claiming and presenting themselves as innocent.
Oh, right.
Right?
Yeah.
And so, half the people who take refuge there are lying to you, right?
Right.
And trying to maybe manipulate you, or, trying to incur your favor to, but even that is pointless, because the Levites who are given them space in their community for this have absolutely nothing to do with the trial that's being conducted.
Right, yeah.
They're not the witnesses. They're not the judges, the elders, and they're certainly not the executioners.
And it makes me think of how, again, like in European churches, we're often places of sanctuary, where a person who is either accused or has committed a crime, if they run into the church and claim sanctuary, okay, nobody can touch them. As long as they're inside the church, they're safe. And how the priest has to watch over them and all that. But it is a biblical concept that they're trying to apply. And yeah, bad people take advantage of it to their own benefit. But good people use it to protect their lives when people are coming after me unjustly. And it's just the church continuing a practice that got established many, many, centuries or millennia earlier. It's that same idea.
Yeah. So if these people are living with you temporarily, I mean, the Levites are responsible for providing their food.
Seems like it. Shelter, food.
The shelters they live in are, there's no permanent residence there, although some maybe had to stay for a long time. And there was even a cap on that. But they had to provide the day-to-day life for these accused slayers for as long as it took.
Yeah, it's almost like you get a new roommate and they happen to be an accused murderer.
Yeah.
And that's awkward at best. Very uncomfortable setting.
Yeah. So you think what it must be like for the moms thinking about their children.
Yes, for sure.
This is the town where my kids kind of go after school and run the streets.
Yep.
School.
Got the playground there in the middle of town, and there's this killer sitting there watching your kids play on the swings,
So they must really have to have developed a certain kind of thick skin, a certain kind of tolerance, a certain kind of protecting undesirables and welcoming undesirables into your community.
I think part of it's also just built into the DNA of their culture, like an honor and shame culture. It's part of what hospitality means. When someone comes under your roof, they come under your protection, even if they're terrible people, right? And so we see various stories of that in the Old Testament, where once someone comes under the protection, like Lot, he'll go to lots of lengths to protect them, even if it doesn't. We're going to get into all that, but so I think they got that, and even though it's super uncomfortable and nerve-wracking, right? They're talking about I can't imagine this the trepidation of well, we're going to bed. Please don't kill anyone. Else.
Right.
Allegedly.
Allegedly.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I think there's a lot of, obviously, all wisdom is in God, but him entrusting this task, which is a sacred task, right? Yep. It's the mechanism that safeguards the sacredness of life that belongs to God. He entrusts that task to his priests and his Levites. And they were so perfect for it. There was just no one who would be better than them precisely because they were aliens and exiles in the land themselves. They themselves don't belong here. Mm-hmm. They themselves are, not part of the mechanisms of power and control in the land. They don't have a vested interest necessarily in keeping the wider tribe of Issachar safe from people like this. Mm-hmm. Right? They have one task. This life belongs to God. The blood is sacred. It belongs to him. I safeguard it whether they're guilty or innocent. Mm-hmm. It's not mine to judge. Now, for the town elders, it is theirs to judge. Yep. They do have a responsibility to figure out whether this person is guilty, find out if there are two witnesses, and conduct an orderly trial. So it's their disconnectedness from all those mechanisms that make them the perfect people to host these cities.
Yeah, and it's interesting that it never talks about the priest doing anything else. You think well, don't they make sure that it's all being followed according to Torah? Not necessarily. It just says that they keep them safe until it's time. That's it. And that's hard to disconnect for me, those things. Because for me, priests are I mean, they're spiritual leaders, they're respected people. Like, I'd want you to weigh in on it. Well, they're not supposed to, actually, and that's kind of an interesting take on it. Where, you'd think they would say something, but technically they don't.
Yeah, and it may be. I mean, when a trial is being conducted, and it's the job of the Levites there to like safeguard the accused. If the elders need wisdom on how this is to be conducted, there are also other Levites in the land.
That's true.
Right, who spend more of their time offering, because not every Levitical city was a city of refuge.
Yeah.
Actually, most of them weren't cities of refuge, right? But there are still Levites who can like weigh in on, this is the process, this is the procedure. We're not a part of it, but we can, since we're the Torah experts, we can instruct you on how it's to be done, but probably not the Levites whose ministry is hospitality. Yeah, so it was a team approach.
Yeah.
So the question then is like, what does any of this have to do with the church? and in what sense is our calling and our mission analogous to those of these priestly hospitality coordinators?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because we talk about the church ideally is a welcoming, safe place for people to come to. And I think a lot of churches strive for that. But this seems to be on a different level.
Did you say a woke welcoming?
I did. I didn't mean
Was
to.
that on purpose?
No, I meant, I was saying welcoming. I came out as woke.
You're anticipating our later discussion.
It's probably. And so, like, we give kind of lip service to we want to be a safe place. But this is...
Come as you are.
Exactly.
Yeah, right.
Whoever you are.
Right, exactly. Come as you are and all that. But do we feel that way about everybody? Do we feel that way about sexual predators, about murderers? I mean, I think people would have a little more uncomfortability with that. And so I think what it does is it challenges a lot of our models of what we think is appropriate church practice, and maybe pushes it a little further.
Yeah. Well, and I think that it helps explain some of the things we see in the New Testament, especially in the life of Jesus, because people were scandalized by the fact that he ate with tax collectors and prostitutes and sinners. And they're like, oh my gosh, we have to keep our distance from them. We're trying to maintain our state of cleanliness and all that kind of stuff. And so distancing ourselves from people who make these bad decisions is part of how like we're showing God our loyalty and our Torah observance and all that. And Jesus says, actually, I have a different system in place. And did that originate with Jesus? Is he the first person to think that? I think what we're trying to illustrate here is that no, Jesus is actually practicing something that God built into Israelite society. And so when he says, bring on the sinners, they can come hang out with me, he's saying, I'm a city of refuge. And you people can do what you have to do. You do whatever thing you have to do. But I'm going to represent God's plan to these people. And so Jesus is becoming like a Levite. He's being that city of refuge. And it's not at all surprising. Oh, now I know why Jesus is so welcoming to sinners. Because Israel was supposed to be doing that all along, and it was a part of their heritage at one point.
Yeah, and often we don't think about what it meant for him to have zealots among his 12. Like it is thought that more than 3 of his 12 were zealots. And zealots were those who sought to strategically undermine the Roman Empire through strategic acts of violence, right? They arranged, strikes of the military commander and acts of vandalism or destruction of Roman property and stuff. Like they were the kind of the gadflies, right? and some of them probably had blood on their hands, because that's what zealots did. And they were the dagger men.
Right, yeah.
And they were like, if there were several among his 12, like how many of these zealots were attracted to Jesus?
Yeah.
And it's just like, these were enemies of the Roman Empire who had blood on their hands. And Jesus and of course he had to convert them. Right?
Right,
the
yeah.
sons of thunder couldn't just rain down judgment on every city they didn't like, and Jesus welcomed people who were deemed unclean, right, for reasons of blood, like, coming into contact with a woman issuing blood that no one else would touch, the lepers, the former killers. When you think about the disciples, and they had a really hard time, the 12 even, welcoming Saul into their community after his conversion. Like, you're a killer. we really don't want you. And Barnabas was kind of like a Levite, right?
Yeah,
Like
big time.
saying, hey, we've got to welcome even the killer into our midst. It's what Jesus would have done.
Yeah.
Jesus on the cross even was praying for those who put him there.
Yeah.
Father, forgive them.
Yep.
And if God really forgave them and they were restored and maybe they were led into fellowship and faith, then the church had to be a place where killers were members. Yeah. And they have to be, radically trusting of God that we're going to open our lives to people who are untouchable, undesirable from wider society, and we trust that God's going to protect us.
Yeah. And I think that's the biggest part right there, because we've already been saying it about how the cities of refuge, you've got legitimate killers in your midst, some of them really bad people. And it's your job. God didn't give you an option. You live in a city of refuge. This is your job. You got to trust God to watch out for it. It's like, okay, God, I'm doing what you said, so I'm going to put my safety, and not just my safety, but the safety of my spouse, my kids. I'm going to put that into your hands. So it does require a tremendous amount of trust to let God handle the stuff that we can't handle, but want to, because it's just human nature.
Yeah, and then you get into the teaching of Paul to the church in Romans, like, beloved, never avenge yourselves. Right? You leave vengeance in the God's hands. Like, God's got mechanisms to deal with the bad people in the world.
Yeah.
And specifically later on in Romans, he says, and he has the governing authorities, right, who have a function to kind of protect wider society and to punish the bad and the evil and to reward the good. Like, God has mechanisms for dealing with the blood offenders of our day. And then he has us, his vehicle of offering people who deserve death, like we deserve death, right? But people who deserve death, we offer them life through Jesus. And we offer them a family and a community that they wouldn't have outside of the family of faith because of who they are and what they've done. Like, this ministry, this risky hospitality, right, that the Levites had to render has been passed on to the church. And that's a hard pill to swallow.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's this tension in our society where everyone's looking for safe spaces, right?
Oh, right, yeah.
These places where I'm not offended, I'm not this, I'm not that, I don't feel uncomfortable. This is the opposite of that. The reality is that it would be super uncomfortable and maybe even at times like repulsive to show hospitality to this. I've heard what this person did. And if true, I don't even want to talk to them, right? And so, I think puts a big challenge in front of Christians about what that looks like, about what does safe space actually entail. It's not safety for those of us who are already in a good space. It's safety for those who have been their backs turned on by society, and that's a whole different way of approaching it.
Yeah, and then you think about, come on, this is what Jesus is teaching on, how many times should I forgive someone? 7 times? No, 70 times 7. Like, bad people with a habit of hurting you, you need to forgive. And love, which is, like you said, in a society that values safety as one of like the prize. Like, I used to think that like the prize American value is freedom. I think that is losing ground to safety. Like, people are willing to give up freedom for safety.
Yep,
it's a good observation. Yeah, and I think that the one thing that I would want to emphasize is to say this is going to be a challenge. Like, there are people listening right now going, "Man, I don't know if I can pull that off." I understand it runs so counter to just our human nature, especially when we want to protect our family and those close to us. And we're like, I just don't know how we're going to be able to do this. And so there's got to be a way that God can train us to do this. Like, how do we become the kind of people who are able to say, I am willing to take this risky behavior? How do I become that person? There's got to be some way that God can help us to go from being the people who are like, I would never do that, to saying, I'm a little afraid, but I'm willing to do that. To me, that's like the next really big question there.
Yeah, I mean, it puts teeth on the teaching about you must be willing to lay down your lives. Yeah. Like, some people lay down their lives by abandoning, aspirations to have family and land and wealth accumulation, and they travel around being evangelists for Jesus.
Yeah.
And the people who choose to like stay put and bear witness to the kingdom there in your community with a family, with land, well, you're not off the hook for laying down your life.
Right.
Like if you're going to be a stationary person, then your home has to be open to undesirables.
Yeah.
Right? Like that.
Exactly.
Everyone lays down their life who follows Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And it just looks different for people who choose a stationary mode as opposed to a mobile itinerant kind of mission.
Yeah.
And so part of how residential people who stay put live on mission is opening their lives, their home, their resources to the stranger, to the other, to someone who might take advantage of you. Right? And we're able to do that, because for us to live as Christ and to die as gain, right? And we don't cling to the stuff of this world. We don't own it the way they do. And again, this is tied to the church's priestly calling, like that we talked about last week in 1 Corinthians 7 about dealing with the things of the world as if not attached to them.
Yeah.
Right? And it's our detachment from the things of this world that allows us to be safe havens for people who otherwise we just wouldn't accept into our world. We would keep them out of our world. So there are all sorts of ways that this applies, and read the chapter for all that. There's the application section has quite a few sections, but the one question that we want to apply it to or bring it to bear on is the current questions about how do Christians embody this sentiment in an age where our country is cracking down on illegal immigrants, and churches are, some churches are opening their doors as places, safe havens and hospitality for them, and some churches aren't, right, because they're illegal. And does this chapter or the principles behind this, right, apply one way or the other?
That's not a loaded question at all.
Oh, yeah. We're not going to get any trouble with this one on our podcast, right?
Yeah, the issue is we're allowing legislation and governments to dictate our approach and our practice, and that's a problem because that's not how the church is supposed to work, right? And so, but you have churches on, and especially denominations on both sides where, they're not here, and of course the narrative, like, well, they're, it's a bunch of rapists and murderers who are coming into our country, and like, okay, and this is like that very rhetoric is very applicable here. It was just like, oh, they're not here legally. That's one thing, but they're using the rhetoric of these are awful people, right, who are coming into, quote, our country, and we need to get them out of here. And I wonder, what the priest in the Old Testament would say about that. Like, oh, this guy who's not from this tribe has just shown up on my doorstep, and he's got blood on his hands, literally. And I'm sorry, man, we don't like your kind around here. Like that, he wouldn't turn him away because his job was to not to turn that person away. And so I think it challenges a little bit of our approach. And so the question is, why, as Christians, are some so adamant that people who are here illegally need to leave, right? Where does that come from? And if it comes from, well, there's a way of doing things that needs to be done, okay, but that's a government thing. I'm talking about you as a person, as a Christian who, is supposed to love your brother and sister. What does that look like? And I think that's not the question we don't often ask. Because the reality is, I'm not making legislation. I'm not deciding their fate, but they might end up on my doorstep. It's quite possible. And so then what am I going to do? Turn them in because the government tells me to? Or am I going to say, let me show you some hospitality and let's figure this thing out, right? Because that's what a priest would do. I'll show you hospitality till we can figure it out.
Yeah.
And I think that's a different and probably it's a better approach because I think that's more what we're called to do and to be as the church and as priests in the church.
Yeah, we can become these individual cities of refuge. And the government's going to do what it does. That's the government's doing its job. Go out there, enact the laws, enforce the laws, do what you got to do. But for me, I have a responsibility to say, all right, my primary accountability is to God. And my responsibility is to reflect his intention for his people, for his kingdom here on earth. And part of that was sometimes his people were those places of refuge. And so this isn't a debate about what the United States should do about its laws. Okay, that's a different topic. But it is a debate about what do we do as the people of God. And we might be the ones to say, look, I know that the avenger of blood is coming down on you or something like that. But when you're with me, you're in a safe place. You're going to have refuge. And that's kind of the vision we're given is to be those places of refuge, sometimes even a little bit dangerous. Yes, it can be dangerous. And now I got to trust God to watch out for me. But this idea of refuge is what we're called to do. And Jesus was that. He was a place of refuge for the prostitutes and the tax collectors and all other forms of sinners and the zealots sometimes. And so how do we then continue to practice that? I'm going to imitate Jesus. I'm going to be that place of refuge. I think those are the kinds of questions that we want to wrestle with.
Yeah, what I like about the Levitical parallel is I think it breaks past, what are the two positions people take in our society. And that's either because I'm a Christian and we're radically hospitable to people who don't deserve it, we must open our doors to illegal aliens that are seeking refuge among us, right? And I think Sam just laid out a compelling case where Christians might want to do that. Like, people are here illegally for a variety of reasons, sure, right? And some may be taking refuge and leaving a place that's extremely dangerous to them. And to the extent that they come in our midst, we have a strong case for offering them a warm meal, a safe place to stay. And so either people, they embrace kind of the radical calling to rescue hospitality, and they stand in judgment upon the government, right, for wanting to send those people back, right? So that's position A, right? We open our homes to them, we open our churches to them, and we are against the government to the extent that the government wants to do something about it. And then the other position is we don't open our homes to them, we don't open our churches to them, and we celebrate the government finally doing something about them, right? Those are kind of the two opposite places. And the Levites are neither of those. They, as exiles themselves, as resident aliens who are not part of the powers and principalities of this world who are coming, right, who are looking for them, we are fellow aliens, right, though we may be legal, right? We open our homes to them, but we don't begrudge the governing authorities for having a responsibility we don't have, which is to protect its borders, right? God doesn't, so it's interesting, like the Levites offered this radical hospitality, and they also respected the role of the Issachar tribe to conduct a trial, to decide based on laws they've inherited, right, on the guilt, and then they hand them over.
Right.
Right? And allow the powers to do what the powers have decided. Like the Levites, and I don't think the Issacharites look down on the Levites for offering refuge. Like, they respected, this is the role of the Levites. They respected them in that capacity. And in turn, the Levites respected their host tribe in its capacity. And it seems like there could be a Christian position like that. And of course, again, every person who's seeking refuge has a different backstory. Right. So it's all complicated, right? But there is a way to respect, like Trump came so hard down on illegal immigration his first term that Biden's administration went the opposite direction and then just opened the floodgates. And then our country had a problem where it needed immigration reform on the left and the right. I mean, the Democrats shoved, shortly before the election season, tried to pass legislation to crack down on illegal immigrants, right? So both parties were united on, okay, there is such thing as having too many people illegally in the country. There is such a thing that throws off and compromises our charity programs, our government resources. There is so much as too many. And so both parties are in agreement that you have to draw the line at a certain level. And maintaining those boundaries and maintaining a healthy ratio that's allowing enough people in that's good and not excessively harmful, that seems to be part of the responsibility of the powers and principalities, to maintain a healthy ratio. So I think the Levite example is for us an example of how to be welcoming ourselves without being anti the governing authority for wanting to crack down on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I would just challenge us. I can already hear, the objections where, well, you might get taken advantage of, or you might, harm might come to your family if you're to welcome, because you don't know their backstory, you don't know why they're here. And I would just challenge us to not hold too tightly to the things of this world, which is the temptation, right? The whole safety over freedom, that's not what we're supposed to do. We're here to be a light to the nations, to show what it's like to live a different kind of life. And if that results in certain consequences, like laying down your life, then that's what we've been called to. We hope and pray that doesn't happen, but that's a reality when we're, what do you call it, risky hospitality. It is risky. And if it doesn't actually become risky for us, then are we actually doing the hospitality right? And I think the challenge might be we may not be.
Yeah. And if we had embraced a posture where, like, hey, as long as they're on my turf, they're safe.
Mm-hmm.
But if the government authorities come and ask for them and they have like charges against them, like if we decide to respect the powers and principalities and say, you can't stay here anymore. Right? I've done as much as I could for as long as I could, but now you're crossing into illegal things and that's not my territory. Then I think if we're being radically hospitable, we're not going to wash our hands of them. No. If they get deported, are we willing to support them? Like if they came here because of hostile situations, or they couldn't pay the bills, or they couldn't make a livelihood, are we going to follow up on them? Are we going to send them money to help them in there? Are we going to advocate for them and try to make it possible for them to get legal immigration, right? And do what we can to help them in that process? Are we radical enough to think that, well, if you're going back there, then you're not going back there alone?
Yeah.
We're gonna send a group of people back with you, and so we can, like, this community you found in Jesus, that if you go back, maybe we can come with you and have a core group of a church plan, right? Like just thinking outside the box of the two options given to us by, the lazy American choice, right? What does it look like to be radically loving and devoted and hospitable? And do we just turn them over and then forget about them? So none of these questions the book deals with. They deal with all sorts of other aspects of it, but it's become a real live question in our society. So I don't know, hopefully some ideas to challenge and shake the box of the conversation a little bit.
Yeah. And if you as a church have done some things to approach this topic of hospitality, share it on our Facebook. We'd like to hear from you. Like, this is what our church has done to try to be hospitable while also, like, sort of being that middle ground.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I don't know if it's me or not, but thanks for joining us in this episode of the After Class podcast. After Class because
the best conversations happen
after class.
Thank you again for listening to this episode of the After Class podcast. ACP is hosted by Sam Long, John Nugent, and Ron Peters. Audio editing and mixing is done by Drew Nyquist. Episode images and descriptions are provided by Darren Harris.